Rome did not establish its huge empire only with brave decisions. He founded it with some borrowings. The brave soldiers of Rome, we visualize ourselves as unstoppable warriors fueled by honor and discipline. But behind every shiny helmet and sharp sword was a very complex and expensive supply chain. Tens of thousands of men needed food, drink, weapons, even women, transportation and monthly wages. Fodder was needed to feed the horses. To take enemy lands, weapons, timber and labor were needed. And of course, it takes money to do these things. A lot of money. So how did Rome cope with many years of conquest? And why is this still important today? Because the more you examine the Roman war mechanism, the more the model emerges. The war was not only fought in the fields. It was within the economic system. And once you set up this system correctly, it can never be stopped again. Expanding globally was not a choice, that it was a financial necessity. Does this situation sound familiar to you? So let's go back in time a bit. In the early days of the Republic, the Roman army was an army of its own people. Anyone who owned an inch of land could be drafted into the military. Soldiers would provide their own weapons and wait to return home after the war. However, as the Republic's territory grew, wars lasted for many years and soldiers moved away from their homes. Thus, this model was now very obsolete. It was no longer possible to pick up a sword and go to war for 2 years. The army needed professionalization. It was then that Rome began to centralize military finance. Military service became a profession and the state paid salaries for it. Not too much, but enough to not upset them. Then came the real turning point. The conquered lands themselves became a source of income. Each new region meant new taxes, new slaves, new underground resources and new tribute. This was a self-sufficient cycle. The war fed the next war. But there was also an interesting and dangerous side to the job. Rome could not rely solely on taxes. He relied just as much on borrowing. During long-lasting or costly wars, such as the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic received large amounts of public loans from the wealthy, especially the equites, Rome's rising elite. Of course, these were not donations for the homeland. They were an investment for the future. And these investors expected interest payments, tax collection rights, and opportunities to multiply their own wealth in newly conquered lands. Thus, war became an industry. And the more profitable it became, the more wars Rome started. Sound familiar? Over time, this militarized economy began to dominate everything. Political power shifted to high commanders who could promise loot. Senators became participants in the violence. Private contractors had a say in everything from logistics to tax collection and collected huge sums of money from the top. This was military-industrial capitalism in toga. So what was the cost? Costs have increased. In order to pay soldiers and creditors, the state had to find new sources of income. When conquests slowed down or rebellions depleted the coffers, Rome did what it knew best: devaluing money. During this process, which began during the reign of Emperor Nero, denarius silver stocks were quietly melted down. Emperors continued this over the next 2 centuries, turning the denarius, once a reliable silver coin, into a feeble promise that nothing validated. The inflation process has begun. Trust between the public and the state has decreased. And in the 3rd century, Rome's economic system went into free fall. Meanwhile, the rich increased their wealth. Senators and equites had secured all their assets with land, slaves and foreign accounts. For the poor, the situation was just the opposite. They were both paying taxes and getting poorer. The elite, on the other hand, not only did not pay taxes, but also received secret information from insiders and protected themselves with agreements. Public services had now collapsed. Corruption had now emerged in Rome. And the financial burden of endless wars fell directly on the lower classes through inflation, labor taxes, and military service obligation. This was not just a military setback. It was also a financial ruin. Now let's look at today together. Governments run large current account deficits. Wars are financed by borrowing money from others. To close this gap, central banks are devaluing the currency as if playing charades. An elite who became rich through defense deals and profiting from the crisis. An economy where the only way to deliver this system is military, financial, or market-based expansion. Of course, this isn't a perfect parallel. But their chemistry is disturbingly familiar. What was experienced from Rome was that an economy based on expansion, especially one based on violent expansion, would eventually fall into an abyss. We run out of places to conquer, resources to extract, or nations to fight. And so, the whole system becomes inward-looking. You will be left with your debts. Expectations continue. But your sources of income dry up. That's when the state starts to oppress its own people. He began to collect heavier taxes from the Roman people. It greatly reduced the value of money. He exercised more control. While the elite strengthened their positions, they organized circuses and feasts to silence the public. Does this sound familiar? Today, this is not called extortion. We call this tax, quantitative easing, or financial policy. But the system is eerily similar. Central banks are printing money day and night. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich are getting richer. The poor, on the other hand, only do grocery shopping with their decreasing salaries. Today, wars are still financed through debt. The United States spent more than $2 trillion on the Afghanistan war, much of it financed by debt. Who makes the deals? Who earns the interest? Who pays the price for inflation, decline in services, and unstable monetary policies? The answer is already clear. And as in Rome, this cycle is self-sufficient. When debts are in default, there is no need for an emergency to print money, just to save the day. You make the extraordinary seem like a normal situation. The longer you succeed in this job, the more you distract the people. Until things go wrong. This is what makes economic history so important. These are not just stories left on dusty shelves. These are warning signs to us. When we look at Rome, we see a state that devolved too much power to private finance, became dependent on expansion, emptied the state treasury, and crushed its own people under the weight of unsustainable obligations, not because it's bad, but because the system doesn't have an off button. Today, we live under a very different roof. An empire that is digital, global, and powered by capital flows rather than legions. But the game played is still the same. Money and power always go together. War is always profitable. Inflation always punishes the weak. And financial illusions always work. So what can you do if things don't go your way? First, try to look at the events from a bird's eye view. Because most people can't look at it like that. And most people think inflation is random. They think that taxes are always necessary for the state, that debt is freedom, and that growth can continue forever. But the Stoics had a word for it: illusion. You can't get rid of the system completely. But at least you can understand it. Instead of playing the game blindly, you can build your own resistance. Not just with money, but also with your mindset. This means examining the history of finance, not just personal finance. This means monitoring not just market excitement but also signs of systemic stress. Essentially, this means asking the question, who profits when I remain confused? In fact, some people don't want you to know the answer to this question. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome financed its wars. Or how governments today do this now. You had to focus on theater. Social media, TV headlines, GDP, anything that distracts you. Not the mechanisms. Not for incentives. But now you are awake. And once you wake up, you can no longer close your eyes. Financial education isn't just limited to budgets and investments. It's about grasping power, understanding systems, and seeing the illusion of stability. From now on, when you hear about a new conflict, a new stimulus, a new economic crisis, do not just stand by. Follow the money trail. Ask who lent money to whom, who ultimately gained, and who ultimately owed money. Because if human history has taught us anything, it is this: empires do not fall when the enemy breaches their walls. They are devastated when math doesn't solve the problem and no one dares to fix it. If what you listened to or watched gave you a new perspective, you can subscribe to my channel. The answers are hidden in the past. I will tell you where to look for them. See you again.